Okay, hello, this is Joe Zimmerman, and I had some podcast listeners request a soothing reading for YouTube, and I did The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. It was such a success that now we're on to book number 2, The Very Persistent Gappers of Fripp by George Saunders, illustrated by Lane Smith, and I hope you find it very soothing and enjoyable. Ever had a burr in your sock? A gapper's like that, only bigger. About the size of a baseball, bright orange, with multiple eyes like the eyes on a potato. And gappers love goats. When a gapper gets near a goat, it gives off a continual high-pitched, happy shriek of pleasure that makes it impossible for the goat to sleep, and the goats get skinny and stop giving milk. And in towns that survive by selling goat milk, if there's no goat milk, there's no money, and if there's no money, there's no food or housing or clothing, and so in gapper-infested towns, since nobody likes the idea of starving naked outdoors, it is necessary at all costs to keep the gappers off the goats. Such a town was Fripp. Fripp was 3 leaning shacks by the sea. Fripp was 3 tiny goat yards into which 8 times a day the children of the shacks would trudge with gapper brushes and cloth gapper sacks that tied at the top. After brushing the gappers off the goats, the children would walk to a cliff at the edge of town and empty their gapper sacks into the sea. The gappers would sink to the bottom and immediately begin inching their way across the ocean floor, and 3 hours later would arrive again at Fripp and split into 3 groups, 1 per goat yard, only to be brushed off again by the same weary and discouraged children, who would stumble home and fall into their little beds for a few hours of sleep, dreaming, if they dreamed at all, of gappers putting them into sacks and dropping them into the sea. In the shack closest to the sea lived a girl named Capable. Earlier that year, her mother had died. Since then, her father had very much liked things to stay as they were. At dusk, Capable would find him in the yard, ordering the sun to stay up, then sitting sadly in the flower bed when the sun disobeyed him and went down anyway. The last thing her mother had ever cooked was rice, and now Capable's father insisted that all his food be white. So in addition to brushing gappers 8 times a day and faithfully mending her gapper sack, Capable also had to mix sugar and milk and cliff chalk into a special white dye and spread it over whatever she was cooking that night. It was a hard life, and it made her tired. "Father," she said one day, "maybe it's time we moved, away from the ocean, away from the gappers." "My dear, I'm surprised at you," he said. "This is our home. It has always been our home. There have always been gappers and exhausted children brushing them off. I myself was once an exhausted child brushing off gappers. It was lovely. The best years of my life, the way they fell to the sea from our bags. And anyway, what would you do with your time if there were no gappers?" "Sleep," said Capable, whose eyes were deep, dark pools. "Ha ha, sleep, yes," said her father sadly, and went off for his afternoon nap. Now, gappers are not smart, but then again, they are not all equally stupid. One day, at the bottom of the sea, one of the less stupid gappers, who had a lump on one side of its skull that was actually its somewhat larger than average brain sort of sticking out, calculated that of the 3 houses in Fripp, The reddish one, Capable's house, was about 15 feet closer to the sea than the next closest house, which, when you are the size of a baseball and have no legs and move around by crinkling and uncrinkling your extremely sensitive belly, is useful information. So that night, instead of splitting into 3 groups, the gappers moved in one very large, impressive, shrieking group directly into Capable's yard. There were approximately 1,500 gappers living in the sea near Fripp. Each Fripp family had about 10 goats. Therefore, there would normally be about 500 gappers per yard or 50 gappers per goat. Tonight, however, with all 1,500 gappers in Capable's yard, there were approximately 150 gappers per goat, since the average goat can carry about 60 gappers before it drops to its knees and keels over on one side with a mortified look on its face. When Capable came out to brush gappers that night, she found every single one of her goats lying on its side with a mortified look on its face, completely covered with shrieking orange gappers. When the other Fripp children came out to brush gappers, they found they had no gappers, so they went back inside and fell asleep. In the house next door lived Mrs. B. Romo, a singer whose children, 2 sons, were also singers. They all sang in a proud and angry way, as if yelling at someone, their faces bright red. "It's a miracle," Mrs. Romo shouted next morning when she came out and discovered that her yard was free of gappers. "This is wonderful. Capable, dear, you poor thing. The miracle didn't happen to you, did it? I feel so sorry for you. God has been good to us by taking our gappers away. Why? I can't say. God knows what God is doing, I guess. I suppose we must somehow deserve it. Boys, come out and look." And her boys, Robert and Gilbert, came out and looked. "What?" said Robert, who was himself only slightly brighter than a gapper. "I don't get it," said Gilbert, who was exactly as bright as a gapper. "No gappers, boys," said B. "See? No more gapper brushing." "So what are you saying, Ma?" said Robert. "Are you saying we don't have to brush gappers as long as there aren't any?" "Is that what you're saying, Ma?" said Gilbert. "Boys, it's a good thing you're such excellent singers," said B. Romo, sort of rolling her eyes at Capable, "because you're certainly not going to win any brain awards." "Well, I don't want a brain award," said Robert. "Me too," said Gilbert. "I don't want a brain award either." "Unless they give money with it," said Robert. "Do they give money with it?" said Gilbert. "In that case, maybe I'll take it." "Money or candy," said Gilbert, "or a trophy." "Or a medal," said Robert. "Unless they pin the medal right directly into your brain," said Gilbert. "In that case, no, I don't want it." "Me too," said Robert. "If they're going to stick a pin into my brain about it, forget it." "Boys, stop talking," said B. Romo. "Stop talking now. Go inside and sing." "Okay," said Robert, "but no brain awards, and that's final," said Gilbert. And the Romo boys went back inside and sang some more angry scales, after which they argued about which of them sang the best, after which they wrestled about which of them sang the best, and there was the sound of some wooden thing breaking, possibly a piano bench. Later that day, Capable came out to brush gappers and found Mrs. Romo saying heave-ho to a team of several strong men from Fritch, the next town over, who had their shoulders to the Romos' little green shack. It was tilted way up, and Capable could see dark dirt and worms underneath and a pair of old shoes. "Hello, dear," Mrs. Romo said. "Hope you don't mind. I'm moving my house as far away from yours as I possibly can. After we spoke earlier, it occurred to me that the only thing separating my yard from your yard is a picket fence, which gappers could easily squeeze through. And one thing I don't need at this point is a yard full of gappers. I suppose they don't bother you anymore. You're probably used to them. You probably even take a kind of crude enjoyment in them. But my boys are made of more sensitive stuff and mustn't be distracted from their singing careers. To the lot line, fellows, lift, men, you can do it. And the men succeeded in lifting the house and moving it very, very close to the third and final house in Fripp, which belonged to Sid and Carol Ronson, who stood in their yard with looks of dismay on their nearly identical frowning faces. "See here," said Sid Ronson. "See here," said Carol Ronson. "What are you doing, Bee?" "What in the world are you doing, Bee?" said Sid. "Good Lord, moving your house so close. You're crowding our little house. Do you see it? Our little house is this blue one here. The one in your house is now clearly touching, Bee." And it was true. The houses were now very, very close. A person could easily hop from roof to roof. The Romo boys were doing just this. They were hopping from roof to roof, singing in angry voices, while the Ronson girls, Beverly and Gloria, craned their heads out the window with their fingers in their ears. "I'm still on my property," said Mrs. Romo. "Good Lord," said Sid. "Good Lord, Bee," said Carol. "You could look right in on us. You could look right in on us being naked in our own private bathroom." "Don't worry, I won't," said Mrs. Romo, "although you will probably hear us singing from time to time." "Lucky us," said Sid Ronson. And immediately, Sid Ronson hired the same 5 men to move his house to the far edge of his property. Now the distance between his house and the Romo house was exactly the same as it had been that morning. It was as if the world had tipped and the Romo and Ronson houses had slid over, but Capable's house had stayed where it was. Over the next few weeks, Capable tried everything she could think of to get rid of the gappers. She tried hiding the goats under blankets, setting the goats on tables, building fences around the goats, shaving the goats, but nothing worked. She moved the goats inside, but the gappers only squeezed under the door and blundered into the dye vat and left white streaks across the floor as they chased the worried-looking goats around the kitchen. Finally, her goats stopped giving milk altogether, which meant no milk and no cheese, and no money from selling the milk and cheese, which meant that Capable and her father were reduced to eating dandelions, which she first had to paint white. "Father," she said late one night, "I can't keep up. Our goats are dying. We're going to have to ask the neighbors for help." "Have we ever done that before?" he said. "We've never needed help before," said Capable. "Well, I'm against it," he said. "If we haven't done it before, it stands to reason that this is the first time we've done it, which means that relative to what we've done in the past, this is different, which I am very much against, as I always have been. As you well know, I have consistently been very, very consistent about this." Then he went back to sleep, and Capable went out to the yard. 20 times she filled her sack with gappers and walked to the cliff. As she brushed and bagged, she thought of her mother, and while thinking of her mother, she seemed to hear her mother's voice saying, "Honey, if you need help, ask for help. You're not alone in this world, you sweet little goof." So she went inside and wrote a note to the Romos and the Ronsons. "Dear friends," it said, "we need your help. The gappers are too much for me. They're killing our goats. Please help, I beg you. Your friend, Capable." Then she left a copy for the Romos and a copy for the Ronsons and went to sleep happy, feeling that tomorrow things would get better. "Good Lord," said Sid Ronson next morning, standing by his fence, reading the note. "What is the meaning of this? What is she thinking? Are those gappers our gappers? Are those goats our goats?" "Good Lord," said Carol Ronson, "they certainly are not. They are her goats and her gappers, as indicated by the fact that they are in her yard. Is her yard our yard? I think not." "I feel that our yards are our yards," said B. Romo. "Quite right," said Sid Ronson. "Well," said B. I, for one, said Carol Ronson, and then forgot what she was about to say and poked Sid Ronson, who almost always knew what she had been about to say. I, for one, he said, poking her back out of habit, do not intend to stand idly by while my poor daughters, Beverly and Gloria, who only recently were freed from gapper duty, go marching out of my yard into her yard and lend a hand. What sort of father would I be? What kind of message would I be sending? Wouldn't I be saying, girls, I don't value you. I think you should work like dogs to solve a problem that isn't even yours. Preposterous. I refuse to say that. I am very sorry that Capable's luck has gone bad, but come to think of it, I, for one, do not believe in luck. Do you know what I do believe? You don't believe in luck, said Carol Ronson, who was quite thrilled that what she had been going to say had turned out to be so very long and opinionated. I believe we make our own luck in this world, said Sid Ronson. I believe that. When my yard suddenly is free of gappers, why, that is because of something good I have done. Because, as both of you ladies know, I have always been a hard worker. As have I, said B. Romo. I, too, have always been a hard worker, as have my boys. And look, no gappers, just like you. I suppose one might say that we, too, have made our own luck with our hard work. Work, 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 said Carol Ronson. Perhaps I should compose a response, said Sid Ronson. That would be super, said B. Romo. So Sid Ronson composed the following response. Dear Capable, it said, we are in receipt of your letter of the other day. That other day, whenever that day was, when you sent that letter that you sent us. We regret to inform you that, although we are very sympathetic to your significant hardships, don't you think it would be better if you took responsibility for your own life? We feel strongly that once you rid your goats of gappers, as we have, you will feel better about yourself, and also we will feel better about you. Not that we're saying we're better than you, necessarily. It's just that since gappers are bad, and since you and you alone now have them, it only stands to reason that you are not, perhaps, quite as good as us. Not that we hate you. We don't. We sort of even like you. Just please get rid of those gappers. Prove that you can do it, just as we proved we could do it. And at that time, and that time only, please come over. And won't that be fun? All of us standing around the fire, sharing a laugh about those bad old days when we all had gappers. Love, your neighbors. Sid crept to Capable's mailbox and slipped the note in. That afternoon, Mrs. Romo finished her usual afternoon session of shouting at her boys for not doing their afternoon scales, then stepped out onto what she called her veranda, which was a little square of hard-packed dirt where the cat liked to leave its chewed-up spitty toys. Walking by was Capable, looking mad, leading her goats on a rope. With Capable was her father, muttering and shaking his head. "Hello, dear," said Mrs. Romo. "How quaint that you've tied all your goats together. They look so cute. Why did you do it? Just being silly? Taking them on a little tour of the town?" "No," said Capable. "I'm giving up." "Why say it so grumpy?" said B. Romo. "And what do you mean you're giving up?" "I'm taking them to Fritch to sell," Capable said. "It's too hard here, and nobody's helping us." "Do you mean me?" said B. Romo. "I hope you don't mean us," said Sid Ronson, leaning out the window with shaving cream on his face. "Did you not get our letter?" said B. Romo. "Did you not get my letter?" said Sid Ronson. "I have to say it's a strange idea," said Carol Ronson. "I have to say it makes me somewhat angry that you should expect us to do your work. I mean, do you cover my roses? Do you polish my antiques?" "Do you force my boys to sing their scales?" said B. Romo. "Do you trim my nose hairs?" said Sid Ronson. "And what will you do then?" said Carol Ronson, "having sold your goats?" "Fish," said Capable. "Good Lord," said Sid Ronson. This was a shocker. The people of Fripp did not fish. They had stopped fishing long ago, when Sid Ronson's great-grandfather had acquired the town's first goat. Sid's great-grandfather had been the richest man in town, and once he got a goat, everyone wanted a goat, and fishing went out of style, and now fishing was considered something one did only if one was not bright enough to acquire a goat. Fish for what? Said C.B. Romo. For fish with a hook and some bait on a hook, which you throw into the sea? To think it's come to this, said Capable's father. To think that my daughter is going to start fishing, which is something she's never done before. You must be heartbroken, said Sid Ronson. I've been crying about it all night, said Capable's father, which is why my mustache is so wet and my nose is so red, which I have to say is completely unprecedented. I've done my best, said Capable, but look at these goats. Everyone looked at the goats, which were skinny and jittery and kept glancing nervously out at the ocean. If you want my advice, said Sid Ronson, work harder. Actually, no, don't work harder, work smarter. Be more efficient than you've ever been before. In fact, be more efficient than is physically possible. I know that's what I'd do. That's what I would do, said B. Romo. Me too, said Carol Ronson. I certainly wouldn't start fishing about it, said Sid Ronson. But Capable knew she had tried her best, and her best hadn't worked, and remembered her mother once saying, just because a lot of people are saying the same thing loudly over and over doesn't mean it's true. So she kissed her father on the cheek and walked her goats out of Fripp. And a few hours later returned with a fishing pole and some hooks and a big heavy book called How to Fish for Fish. Remember that less stupid gapper with the brain poking out the side of his head? That night, he deduced that the reddish Fripp shack, the one they had come to love so well, was now totally without goats. He deduced this by systematically leading his team of 1,500 gappers blindly around Capable's yard for approximately 6 hours. Once he had confirmed the total absence of goats, he led his team into the Romo's yard, where he found 10 fat, complacent goats who were soon lying on their sides, mortified, covered with bright orange gappers, making the usual high-pitched, joyful shrieking noise, which woke B. Romo from a sweet dream in which she was engaged to a handsome man who loved to hear her sing. She was singing and singing when suddenly her fiancé turned into a vacuum cleaner, and apparently, in response to her excellent singing, began making a high-pitched, joyful shrieking noise. The shrieking was louder than her singing, however, so B. Romo stepped on the little switch on her fiancé's foot to make him stop shrieking, so he could better hear her singing. When that didn't work, she woke with an angry look on her face, having decided never to date a vacuum cleaner again, especially one who didn't properly appreciate her singing. She then realized with some alarm that even though she had stepped very firmly on her fiancé's foot, the high-pitched, joyful shrieking noise still hadn't stopped. Imagine her surprise when she went to the window and saw her goats lying on their sides, mortified, covered with gappers. B. Romo let out a high-pitched, shrieking noise of her own that was not a bit joyful. "Good Lord," said Sid Ronson from his bed. "Is that B? Is that B shrieking? Is she shrieking or singing?" "It's always so hard to tell," said Carol Ronson. They rushed to the window and saw the Romo boys, Robert and Gilbert, frantically brushing gappers, just like in the old days. "Robert, Gilbert," said Sid Ronson. "See here, boys. How did this happen?" But Robert and Gilbert were too breathless and sweaty to answer. "Oh, Sid," said Carol Ronson, "check our goats. Are our goats fine?" "I am happy to say that our goats appear to be fine," Sid said. "They are actually standing at the fence watching Robert and Gilbert, sort of smiling. Can goats smile? Our goats appear to be smiling." "But no gappers," said Carol Ronson. "No gappers," said Sid Ronson. "Thank God," said Carol Ronson. "We are so blessed." "I feel like praying," said Sid Ronson. "I feel like thanking God for giving us whatever trait we have that keeps us so free of gappers." "We should," said Carol Ronson. "We should pray." And the Ronsons prayed, thanking God for making them the sort of people they were, the sort of people who had no gappers. And they prayed that God would forgive Bee for not being that sort of person and would have mercy on her, and in his infinite mercy would make Bee into a better sort of person and take all her gappers away. Meanwhile, Capable was teaching herself to fish. All day she stood on the beach in a pair of dumpy green overalls. Sometimes she practiced getting her line caught in a tree. Sometimes she practiced peeling her worm off her forehead while feeling grateful that she hadn't just succeeded in hooking her own eyebrow. Other times she practiced sitting frustrated and near tears in the sand. At one point, having just knocked herself down by trying to reel in her own shoe, which unfortunately at that time was still on her foot, she looked up to see Beverly and Gloria Ronson staring down at her with their eyebrows held very high. "You should be glad we're not boys," said Beverly. "Boys would not like that, what you just did," said Gloria. "Boys do not like girls who wear overalls and knock themselves over with their own fishing thingamabobs. Boys like girls who wear nice dresses and who, if they absolutely have to fall over, do so only after being pushed over by a boy who's just kidding, who only knocked them over to show how much he liked them," said Beverly. "At least that's been my experience." "Yes," said Gloria, "although some boys might not mind a girl who falls over if that girl giggled a bit and needed his help to get up." "True," said Beverly, "although the type of boy I like, he is the type of boy who likes the type of girl who not only never falls over, but rarely even moves, because she is so graceful. She just stands there absolutely still while looking very pretty, such as this." "Such as this here," said Gloria, what we're going to do right now." And both Ronson girls stood very still and looked sort of pretty if you like the kind of girl who, to look sort of pretty, has to stand very still. "Why do you care so much about what boys like?" said Capable. And at this point, Beverly and Gloria stopped standing perfectly still in order to gasp, turn red in the face, then fold and unfold their largish ears several times with their fingers as if there were some blockage that kept them from hearing her correctly. "I totally care what boys like," said Beverly, "especially cute boys." "I even care what ugly boys like," said Gloria, "because who knows," said Beverly, "an ugly boy might turn out to be cute later." "Or he might have a cute friend," said Gloria. "Take Bob Burns," said Gloria. "He's ugly. His nose is about a foot long. But guess who he's friends with?" "Bernie Ben," said Beverly. "Oh my God, is Bernie's nose ever not a foot long? His nose is so cute. It's just the right length." At that moment, Capable caught her first fish, which came skittering across the beach like a silver coin that had suddenly come to life and was trying to get a hook out of its mouth. "Gosh, yuck," said Gloria. "Watch it. That thing on that hook nearly brushed right against my new tights." "One thing we do not need is fish goo on our new tights," said Beverly and led Gloria off the beach. The fishing was good. By 10, Capable had caught enough fish for a nice dinner. The rest of the morning she swam and slept. In the early afternoon, she swam some more, made a sandcastle, and daydreamed a bit. She daydreamed about the old days when her father used to make her mother laugh by holding radishes in his eye sockets. She daydreamed about dressing up the Roma boys in goat suits and locking them in a closet full of gappers. In the late afternoon, she daydreamed further, slept again, woke up, went for a swim, made a second sandcastle, then walked home happy, dragging behind her a huge gapper sack full of fish. By noon the next day, B. Romo's goats had stopped giving milk. Carol," she said that afternoon at the fence, "why not send over your girls? We'll make a party of it. A cookie and milk party. And Carol, do you have any cookies? And do you have any milk for the party? Oh, Carol, I'm so worried. My boys are so tired. They never sing any more. They only fall asleep in the yard with those horrible gappers crawling all over their arms, the arms with which they used to gesture so beautifully while they sang. I worry about their singing careers. Even I myself am singing less. I'm so worried about them." "Not everyone can be a singer, Bee," said Carol. We all must accept our lot in life. Some of us are singers and some of us are gapper brushers. And it seems to me that if you would simply happily accept the fact that your kids are gapper brushers, and always will be, gosh, just think how happy you'd be. Oh, Carol, said Bee, starting to weep, things are going badly for us. Life is mysterious, said Carol. Isn't it, though, said Bee, and tried to get a hug from Carol, but Carol, afraid that a gapper or two might be hiding under Bee's tremendous operatic gown, pretended to suddenly sneeze, taking 2 very large steps back from the fence. But you'll come to the party, said Bee, the milk and cookie party, and you'll bring milk and cookies, and your kids, who will bring their gapper brushes? Oh gosh, won't it be fun? Well, Bee, said Carol, to tell the truth, that doesn't sound like all that much fun, really. Us brushing your gappers when we ourselves have none. And with gappers being so disgusting and all, what fun is that? Do you see what I mean? Well, aren't you suddenly a snoot, said Bee Romo. A snoot, cried Carol. Are you calling me a snoot? Good Lord! Who's calling who a snoot? Said Sid Ronson, emerging from a bush he'd been trimming. Bee called me a snoot, said Carol Ronson. I think I'm going to cry, said Bee Romo. Oh, brother, said Sid Ronson. First you call my wife a snoot, and then you start crying? Good Lord. You'd think Carol would be the crying one. Carol, come inside at once. I won't have my wife being called a snoot by someone with so many gappers. The nerve. And the Ronsons went inside. Bee Romo stayed outside, thinking about possibly starting to cry, but since no one was around except the 1,500 gappers, who just that minute were squeezing through her fence, she decided not to cry, but instead went inside and called the team of very strong men from Fritch and asked could they come to her house first thing next morning. First thing next morning, Carol and Sid Ronson looked out their bedroom window to find the team of very strong men from Fritch walking past their house very slowly, with shaky knees and red faces, and sweat flying off their trembling arms, and Bee Romo's house on their shoulders. Just past the Ronsons' house, the strong men set the Romo house down, brushed off their hands, wiped their foreheads, and accepted a big wad of money from Bee Romo. See here, said Sid Ronson. What are you doing, Bee? Good Lord! Why are you putting your house on the other side of our house, in that vacant lot? The vacant lot by the swamp? None of your beeswax, you snoot, said Bee Romo. Again with the snoot talk, said Carol Ronson. Fine, Bee, said Sid Ronson. If you want to live in a vacant lot, live in a vacant lot. It's no skin off our noses. Only stop calling us snoots. And don't start in again with that awful singing, said Carol Ronson. A few hours later, that less stupid gapper with the sticking out brain led his gappers into the former Romo yard, found it goatless, and proceeded directly into the Ronson yard. Sid Ronson was making lunch when he heard the high-pitched, joyful shrieking and literally dropped his omelet on the dog, who quickly ate it. Good Lord, Sid Ronson shouted. Girls, get out there and start brushing. Brush like the wind, girls. This is terrible. Just awful. I blame Bee. Don't blame me, shouted Bee, standing at her window in her big operatic gown. Accept your lot in life. Ha ha, you snoots. Let's see how you like it. Just look at my goats now. Good Lord, said Carol Ronson. Bee's goats appear to be smiling. How about our goats, said Sid Ronson. Do they appear to be smiling? I can't tell, said Carol Ronson. There are too many gappers on their faces for me to see their mouths. Good Lord, said Sid Ronson. We'll see about this, Bee. Two can play at this game. And he rushed out of his house in the bathrobe and gave a big wad of money to the team of very strong men from Fritch, who, though still out of breath, carried his house past the Romo house to the lip of the swamp. After which, Bee Romo paid the team of very strong men from Fritch to carry her house past the Ronson house, literally into the swamp. After which, Sid Ronson paid the team of very strong men from Fritch to carry his house past the Romo house even further into the swamp. This went on well into the afternoon, at which time the Romo and Ronson houses were so far into the swamp that the Romos and the Ronsons could only stay dry by sitting on the peaks of their respective roofs, surrounded by their children and their goats and a few treasured household items. Plus, they were all completely out of money. "Goodbye, folks," said the leader of the team of very strong men from Fritch. "Have a nice day, and thanks for all the money." By now it was getting dark and cold, so Sid Ronson led his wife and children and goats off the roof, and they swam, shivering, with looks of disgust on their faces, through the swamp, followed by the scowling, shivering, disgusted Romos and the scowling, shivering, disgusted Romo goats. At that moment, Capable came up from the sea with her big gapper sack full of fish. "What are those you have there?" said Carol Ronson. "Are those fish? Fish you caught in the actual sea?" "They don't look half bad," said B. Romo. "Actually, they look sort of yummy. You know what might be fun? Maybe you could teach me and Robert and Gilbert to fish. Maybe for fun, you could, lend us a pole and some worms and sort of teach us to fish." "And maybe you could also teach us to fish," said Sid Ronson. "And maybe also we could all live with you a while," said Carol Ronson, "just until we can sell our goats in Fritch and use the money to get our houses out of the swamp." "Ha ha," said Sid Ronson. "Somehow our houses ended up in that darn swamp." Capable looked at her neighbors, who were shivering and covered with swamp muck, and remembered the way they had all refused to help her. Then she went into her house and shut the door. She made a fire and cooked the fish. She sat down with the plate of fish in front of her window. She watched the Romos and Ronsons swim back across the swamp and remount their houses. She watched Robert Romo's shoe slip off and fall in the muck. She watched Sid Ronson sitting with his head in his hands, possibly weeping, and Carol Ronson sort of consoling him by patting him on the back. And she soon found that it was not all that much fun being the sort of person who eats a big dinner in a warm house while others shiver on their roofs in the dark. That is, it was fun at first, but then got gradually less fun until it was really no fun at all. "Father," she said, "I guess we'll be having some company." "What in the world?" he said. "Our house is so small, and there are so many of them. We have so little, and they'll use so much. This is a really big change. It makes a lot of extra work." "Yes, it is," said Cable. "Yes, it does." "But we're still doing it," he said. "Yes, we are," she said, and called the neighbors in and put water on for tea, because she knew that tea would taste good to people who had recently been swimming in a freezing, mucky swamp. Then she cooked up a bunch more fish, remembering to paint a fish white for her father, who at that moment said something amazing. "You remind me of your mother," he said, "so generous and all." Then he did something amazing. He ate an unpainted fish. So the next morning, and every morning after that, Capable and her father and the Romos and the Ronsons went down to the sea and fished, and life got better. Not perfect, but better. The Ronson girls still sometimes stood completely motionless in order to look somewhat pretty. The Romo boys still argued, often about who was a better worm finder, after which they wrestled about who was a better worm finder, after which they argued about who'd gotten more sand down his underwear during the wrestling, after which they hopped up and down, comparing the amount of sand that came dribbling out of their underwear. Mrs. Romo still burst into song from time to time, prompting the Ronsons to cover their ears, after which Mrs. Romo would sing louder, sort of pursuing the wincing Ronsons down the beach. But generally, on most days, everyone was happier. Except, of course, the fish. And the gappers. For weeks afterwards, the gappers came sadly into town looking for the goats. But the goats were in Fritch, fat and happy. Finally, that less stupid gapper, the one with the sticking out brain, called a meeting. Seeing as how there were no longer any goats in Fripp, he proposed that they stop loving goats. The goats had never returned their affections. The goats had taken them for granted. Goats stunk, actually. What was the point of loving someone who only nipped at you with its sharp yellow teeth whenever you joyously shrieked because you were happy to see it? It was an outrage. They had been played for fools. Would it not, he proposed, be more prudent for them to love something that might actually love them back, something solid and reliable, something that was actually still present in Fripp? What did he have in mind? The other gappers asked. What was still in Fripp that might possibly love them back? Fences, the bright gapper replied, and he began singing the praises of the attractive yet reliable fences of Fripp, which never, to his knowledge, had nipped anything with their teeth, not having teeth, and which never, to his knowledge, had even nipped anything with their gates, but had only stood with great dignity in all sorts of weather, looking out very calmly to sea, as if waiting for something wonderful to emerge from the sea and begin madly loving them. So the gappers took a vote, and though they were not in perfect agreement, one believed they should begin loving wadded-up pieces of paper, another believed they should begin loving turtles, particularly turtles who were dying, particularly dying turtles who nevertheless kept a positive attitude. The gappers still very much admired and trusted that less stupid gapper, and voted to begin madly loving fences. Which is how Fripp came to be what it is today, a seaside town known for its relatively happy fisher people and its bright orange shrieking fences. The end.